So for today's video, I'm going to talk about the different categories of propaganda. Since in the intro, it said that Jacques Ellul is the father of propaganda, has a very unique perspective on propaganda and a very thorough perspective. So I thought just to learn the categories would be very useful in our day-to-day lives. Despite a general belief, propaganda is not a simple phenomena, and one cannot lump together all of its forms. Types of propaganda can be distinguished by the regimes that employ them. Soviet propaganda and American propaganda do not resemble each other. Hitler's propaganda was very different from present-day Chinese propaganda, but resembled Stalinist propaganda. Blah 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 details. Within the same regions, even within the same regime, completely different conceptions can coexist. The Soviet Union is the most striking example of this. And then those who think of Soviet propaganda only as it was under Stalin are not understanding it was different times and at different ranges of propaganda. But aside from these political and external categories, one must define other differences that rest on certain internal traits of propaganda. Now we get to the internal traits, the secrets of propaganda. First, we must distinguish between political propaganda and sociological propaganda. We shall not dwell long on the former because it is the type called immediately to mind by the word propaganda itself. It involves techniques of influence employed by a government, party, administration, a pressure group, with a view to changing the behavior of the public. The choice of methods used is deliberate and calculated. The desired goals are clearly distinguished and quite precise, though generally limited. Most of the themes and objectives of propaganda are political, like Hitler or Stalin. This is the type of propaganda that can be most clearly distinguished in advertising. The latter has economic ends, the former political. So, I think he's saying economic is sociological propaganda, and political is political propaganda. Political propaganda can be either strategic or tactical. The former establishes the general line, the array of arguments, the staggering of the campaigns. The latter seeks to obtain immediate results within that framework, such as wartime pamphlets and loudspeakers, to obtain the immediate surrender of the enemy. But this does not cover all propaganda, which also encompasses phenomena much more vast and less certain. The group of manifestations by which any society seeks to integrate the maximum number of individuals into itself, to unify its member behavior according to a pattern, to spread its style of life abroad, and thus to impose itself on other groups. We call this phenomenon sociological propaganda, to show, first of all, that the entire group, consciously or not, expresses itself in this fashion, and to indicate, secondly, that its influence aims much more at an entire style of life than opinions or even one particular course of behavior. So, obviously, it seems the sociological propaganda is much more pernicious than political propaganda, but everybody just pays attention to the political masculine aspect of propaganda, but ignores the much more menacing and ubiquitous sociological propaganda. Behavior management, behavior control. Of course, within the encompass of sociological propaganda, okay, so this is just the introduction. It's a long book, but paragraph or chapter, subchapter. But this is the ending of the chapter. So this would be a good summary. Let's check it out. Propaganda's content, therefore, tends to be rational and factual. But is this enough to show that propaganda is rational? Besides content, there is a receiver of the content, the individual, who undergoes the barrage of propaganda or information. When an individual has read a technical and factual advertisement of a television set or a new automobile engine, and if he's not an electrician or a mechanic, what does he remember? So you see all this information, but if you don't know what the field that this information is presented in very well, what can you really know about it? Can he describe a transistor or blah blah blah? Of course not. All those technical descriptions and exact details will form a general picture in his head, rather vague but highly colored. And when he speaks of the engine, he will say, "It's terrific." So, because of his superficial understanding of the field, he will think it's great, because even though he doesn't understand anything about the engine. It is exactly the same with all rational, logical, factual propaganda. After having read an article on what in the United States or on steel in the Soviet Union, does the reader remember the figures and statistics? Has he understood the economic mechanisms? Has he absorbed their line of reasoning? So do you remember the figures and statistics? Do you understand the economic mechanisms? Have you absorbed the line of reasoning? If he's not an economist by profession, he will retain an overall impression, a general conviction that these Americans are amazing, they have methods, progress is important after all, or whatever country. And similarly, emerging from the showing of a film such as Alger Franque, he forgets all the figures and logical proofs and retains only a feeling of rightful pride in the accomplishments of France and Algeria. So feelings, these facts and figures are just inducing feelings and thus serving as propaganda, if done as propaganda, which all the corporate world is all about, obviously. Thereafter, what remains with the individual affected by this propaganda is a perfectly irrational picture, a purely emotional feeling, a myth. The facts, oh wow, in India there's a word called mithya, or illusion. The fact, the data, the reasoning, all are forgotten, and only the impression remains. And this is indeed what the propagandist ultimately seeks, for the individual will never begin to act on the basis of facts or engage in purely rational behavior. What makes him act is the emotional pressure, the vision of a future, the myth. The problem is, damn, that's deep. The problem is to create an irrational, well, Aldous Huxley said that up to 80% of people or 60% of people are suggestible, 40% or something are immediately suggestible and they believe anything, and the other smaller percent takes more time. That's why we have to go under another lockdown, I guess. And yeah, that's what he's saying here. Very good observations, accurate observations. That response, so the problem is to create an emotional response on the basis of rational and factual elements. That response must be fed with facts. Those frenzies must be provoked by rigorously logical proofs. Thus, propaganda in itself becomes honest, strict, exact, but its effect remains irrational because of the spontaneous transformation of all its contents by the individual. So it's having to do with the pitta dosha, like I say. That's the fire, the transformational energy, and people are lacking the fire, so they just absorb. That's what we've been trained to do. No smoking allowed. We emphasize that this is true not just for propaganda, but also for information. Except for the specialist, information, even when it is very well presented, gives people only a broad image of the world. And much of the information disseminated nowadays eliminate personal judgment and the capacity to form one's own opinion even more surely than the most extravagant propaganda. Oh my God. That reminds me of school, and not just school, but what Alex Jones says about news and how they throw all these different informational things right at the same time at you. Like some kind of spell. And you eliminate your personal judgment and capacity to form your own opinion, which is why the truth comes from silence. Otherwise, there's going to be violence in your mind. Tired, it's mind tired, unwired to seek rewards for the works, and the money is not satisfactory in this time, right? Gee, what? Right there. So he's saying, this claim may seem shocking, but it is a fact that excessive data do not enlighten the reader or the listener. They drown him. He cannot remember them all, or coordinate them, or understand them. If he does not want to risk losing his mind, he will merely draw a general picture from them. And the more facts supplied, the more simplistic the image. The more facts supplied, the more simplistic the image. If a man is given one item of information, he will retain it. If he is given 100 data in one field or on one question, he will have only a general idea of that question. But if he is given 100 items of information on all the political and economic aspects of a nation, he will arrive at a summary judgment. The Russians are terrific, and so on. And same thing with coronavirus, If they just gave us, if they didn't come at us so fast with all this pandemic emergency, then maybe we would have a better understanding of what the hell is actually going on with this stupid nonsense on the news. But since they're rushing us, we cannot absorb the information. And the general people are coming to their sheepish conclusions about, their behavior, being controlled. A survey of data, far from permitting people to make judgments and form opinions, prevents them from doing so and actually paralyzes them. They are caught in a web of facts and must remain at the level of the facts that they have been given. They cannot even form a choice or a judgment in other areas or on other subjects. Thus, the mechanism of modern information induces a sort of hypnosis on the individual, who cannot get out of the field that has been laid out for him by that information. His opinion will ultimately be formed solely on the basis of the facts transmitted to him, and not on the basis of his choice and his personal experience. The more the techniques of distributing information develops, I need to read that again. His opinion will be ultimately formed solely on the basis of the facts and not on the basis of his choice and his personal experience. So it's just like an argument, not a solution. Propaganda. The techniques of distributing information develop, the more the individual is shaped by such information. And it's not true that, so this is 1965, right? And this is not true that he can choose freely with regard to what is presented to him as the truth. And because, it is not true he can choose freely with the information. It's very obvious now. And because rational propaganda thus creates an irrational situation, it remains propaganda, an inner control over the individual by a social force, which means that it deprives him of himself. So rational propaganda creates an irrational situations and remains propaganda, therefore, and it is an inner control over the individual by a social force, which means that it deprives him of himself. Oh wow. So that's the evil propaganda. What we learned was the different types, sociological and political. A little introduction of sociological propaganda. And I tried to say it's